200 warriors don't just appear outside a man's barn for no reason. They ride with purpose, their silence heavier than thunder, their eyes sharper than any blade. They come to demand answers, to reclaim what was taken, or to spill blood until justice feels satisfied. But this isn't where the story begins. It begins with one man, living on the far edge of the Llano Estacado, where the grasslands stretch so far they seem to swallow the sky. His name was Elias McKenna. Folks in town called him Quiet Rancher, the kind of man who spoke only when necessary and preferred the company of cattle over people. He lived with the land, not against it. Years alone had carved his face into stone, lined with sun and wind, and left his blue eyes with the hollowed-out look of someone who had once loved and buried too much. His ranch sat 30 miles from Abilene, nothing more than a sagging barn, a stone chimney, and a windmill that creaked like an old man's knees. Out here, loneliness was thicker than dust. The nights were long, the coyotes sang in mourning, and the prairie grass whispered against the fence posts like an old hymn. It was late October when the air turned sharp. Winter was coming fast, and the cattle were restless in their pens. Elias had been mending a split rail near dusk when his dog, Scout, pricked his ears and gave a low growl. Elias froze, hammer half raised, his eyes narrowing toward the barn. Something had shifted inside. A faint scrape, a hollow shuffle. Not the sound of livestock. He set the hammer down and reached for the rifle leaning against the post. His boots crunched the frost-stiff dirt as he crossed the yard. Every step felt heavy, as though the prairie itself held its breath. The barn loomed in front of him, its weathered boards glowing faintly in the moonlight. Elias pulled the latch slow, pushing the door open with the barrel of his Winchester. The scent hit him first, sweat, blood, and something faintly sour like sickness. Scout padded in low to the ground, hackles raised. There, in the corner beneath a pile of hay, was not a thief, nor an outlaw, but a child. Her hair hung in dark, tangled ropes, her cheeks hollowed, lips cracked and bleeding from thirst. She wore buckskin torn at the shoulder, and her small frame looked like it might splinter beneath the weight of her own bones. Her eyes, black, wide, unblinking, locked on him like a cornered animal's. Elias froze. His finger rested against the trigger guard, though he didn't squeeze. She was no older than 12, maybe 13. A Comanche girl, starving, half dead. Hey friends, don't forget to like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments which city and country you're watching from. The dog crept closer, sniffed, then whimpered softly. Elias lowered the rifle. Lord Almighty. His voice rasped in the cold air. The girl didn't move, didn't flinch. Her hands clutched the ragged hem of her dress as if ready to fight with nothing but fingernails. Her breath came shallow, wheezing faintly, and Elias could see the fever shining off her skin. For a long moment, the silence was unbearable. Outside, the wind rattled the dry grass. Inside, it was just a broken child and a man who'd buried his own years ago. He crouched, set the rifle aside. "You're hurt," he said, though he knew she wouldn't understand. "Hungry?" Her eyes flicked to the barn door, then back to him. She was calculating, measuring him. He'd seen that. Same look in a wild horse, deciding whether to bolt or bite. Elias straightened, slow and deliberate, like a man easing up from prayer. He went to the feed room, took down a tin cup and dipped it into the water barrel. The girl's gaze followed him with animal suspicion. When he held the cup out, she didn't take it. He set it gently on the hay beside her. Only after he stepped back did she reach, trembling fingers wrapping around the tin. She drank fast, spilling half down her chin, coughing, then clutching the cup as if it were the only thing tethering her to life. Elias stood in the half-dark, arms crossed, the weight of memory pressing against his chest. His wife had died from fever. His boy, 8 years old, taken by raiders near San Saba, never seen again. That was years back, but grief never really leaves a man. And now, staring at this girl, He felt that grief stir, raw and fresh. He should have ridden to town. Should have told Sheriff Collins. Should have let the army deal with it. That was the sensible thing, the safe thing. But as he watched her, ribs showing through buckskin, eyes too big for her face, he knew he couldn't. The prairie had brought her to his door, and for reasons he couldn't yet name, it felt like the Lord himself had placed her there. She set the cup down, coughing again, then slumped against the hay. Her eyes fluttered but didn't close, as though afraid she'd never open them again. Elias knelt once more, pulling off his coat. He draped it around her shoulders, careful not to startle her, though she flinched anyway. Her body was burning with fever beneath the cold fabric. "You'll freeze out here," he said quietly. For the first time, her gaze softened, just slightly. Her lips moved, whispering something he couldn't understand. Elias sat back on his heels. The night outside was growing colder, stars scattering across the endless sky. Somewhere far on the horizon, coyotes yipped, their voices rising like mourners. He looked at her again, at the fragile weight of her body beneath his old coat, and felt the ground shift beneath him. He didn't know it yet, but this was the moment. His life would change. Tomorrow the world would come for him. Tomorrow 150 riders would thunder across his land. But tonight it was only him, a starving girl, and a choice heavy enough to tilt the earth. Elias didn't sleep that night. He sat on a stool by the barn wall, rifle leaning against his knee, lantern burning low, watching the girl breathe shallow against the hay. Scout curled near her feet, as if he had already claimed her as his. Each cough from her chest sounded like it came from a hollow cavern. Fever was running high. By morning the frost had painted the grass silver, and the cattle bawled impatiently in the pens. Elias fetched a kettle of water from the windmill and set it to boil over the hearth inside the cabin. He stirred oats into it, thick and plain, then carried the steaming bowl back to the barn. The girl stirred at the smell. Her dark eyes blinked against the weak light cutting through the barn slats. She didn't reach for the food until he set it down a few feet away. Then she crawled forward like a starving pup and scooped the mush into her mouth with trembling hands, ignoring the steam, burning herself in her haste. Elias stood silent, hat in his hand, feeling both pity and dread. He knew what he was looking at. This wasn't just a hungry child. She was Comanche. If the wrong eyes saw her here, on his land, wrapped in his coat, fed with his food, trouble would follow like buzzards to a carcass. Still, he watched her eat, and something inside him softened, the way a hard knot sometimes comes loose with time. By noon, he saddled his bay horse and rode into town for supplies. He told himself it was just to fetch more medicine, more food. But as he rode down Abilene's main street, past the saloon and general store, eyes followed him the way they always did. Quiet curiosity for the solitary rancher who rarely came around. Sheriff Collins tipped his hat from the boardwalk. "Elias, haven't seen you in a spell." Elias reined in. "Been busy." The sheriff squinted, chewing his toothpick. "You hear about the raiding party spotted west of here? Folks say a Comanche band's been ranging close. Best keep your cool." Rifle loaded. Elias nodded once. His throat was dry. At the general store, Mrs. Pettigrew fussed over him like always. "You're too thin, Elias. Living out there with only that dog for company, no wonder. You'll waste away like your poor wife did." He offered a polite half-smile, bought quinine, flour, coffee, and bandages. As he paid, she leaned closer. "You hear what happened to the Parker boy? They found him outside town, scalped clean. Lord help us, they're savages. Don't matter if it's man, woman, or child, they'll kill." Elias's hand tightened around the coins. He didn't answer. On the ride back, the prairie seemed to stretch farther than before. Every shadow felt like it hid eyes. He thought of the girl, curled in his barn, skin burning with fever. He thought of Mrs. Pettigrew's words. When he returned, she was asleep again, face slack, breath rattling. He mixed the quinine in a cup of water, woke her gently and coaxed it down her throat. She gagged but swallowed. For the rest of the day, he worked the ranch, though his mind stayed with her. He mended fence posts, hauled water, split firewood, chores that usually filled his silence. But now the silence pressed heavy, filled with questions he didn't want to face. That evening, he sat by the cabin fire with his supper untouched. Scout scratched at the door, and when Elias let him out, the dog trotted straight to the barn. Elias followed. Inside, the girl sat upright for the first time, his coat wrapped tight around her. She watched him with those black eyes that seemed older than her years. Her lips parted and she spoke, soft, halting. He caught only a word. Water. He fetched it quickly, handed it to her. She drank slow this time, learning trust in increments. "You've got fight in you," Elias said, quietly. He doubted she understood, but his voice softened as though speaking to his own boy. The next morning, word spread fast. By the time Elias went to fetch more wood, his neighbor Hank Dobbs was riding up the trail. Hank was a heavy-set rancher with a beard like a bear's pelt and a temper to match. "Morning, Elias," he called, reining up. "Heard you bought medicine in town. You sick?" "Not me," Elias said. Hank squinted past him, toward the barn. "What you got in there?" "Calf," Elias lied. Hank sniffed, spitting tobacco into the dirt. "Well, keep your eyes open. Sheriff says Comanche scout's been spotted. If I caught one of them on my land, I'd put a bullet in him before they took mine." Elias's jaw tightened. "I'll handle my land." Hank stared at him a moment longer, then tugged his reins. "Suit yourself." Elias watched him ride off, dust rising behind his horse. His heart pounded. Hank had seen something in his eyes, some hesitation. Folks like Hank could smell secrets, and secrets out here were dangerous. That night, Elias dreamed of his boy, again. In the dream, he was chasing him across the prairie, always just out of reach. When he woke, sweat cold on his neck, he went to the barn. The girl was awake, sitting against the hay, watching the lantern light flicker. She looked small, beneath his coat, but her gaze was steady now, sharper than before. Elias crouched near her. "You'll get better. You'll need strength. I don't know your name, but—" His voice faltered. "You're safe here." Her lips moved. A word, soft, unfamiliar, then again clearer. "Taya." He blinked. "Taya." He repeated it, clumsy on his tongue. Her eyes softened a fraction. It was the first moment that felt almost human, not survival. Elias sat back, rubbing a hand across his beard. Tomorrow, someone else might ride by. Tomorrow, Sheriff Collins might start asking why Elias bought quinine. Tomorrow, the whole world might come knocking. But tonight, it was just him, a girl named Taya, and a decision that would change the rest of his life. Because the smart thing was to turn her over. Everyone in town would say the same. But Elias already knew in his bones that he wouldn't, and once that choice was made, there was no undoing it. The third night after finding her, Elias woke to a sound he hadn't heard in years. Hoofbeats. Slow, distant, deliberate. He pushed back from the bed, heart already pounding, and reached for his rifle. Scout growled low, ears pricked toward the north pasture. Elias slipped on his boots, stepped onto the porch, and let the cold night air fill his lungs. At first there was nothing. Just the vast hush of prairie and the shimmer of stars over the horizon. Then, there it was again, the faint rhythm of horses. Not one, not two. Many. Elias's gut clenched. He stood there, motionless, until the sound faded into silence. But it wasn't the kind of silence that put a man at ease. It was the waiting kind, heavy as storm clouds. By morning, the cattle were restless, lowing nervously. Elias rode the fence line, scanning the ridge. Twice he thought he saw movement, a shadow slipping through the tall grass, gone before his eyes could fix on it. Scouts, watching, measuring. When he returned to the barn, Taya was awake, sitting, cross-legged on the hay. The fever had broken, leaving her face pale but alert. She followed his movements, quiet as always. But when Scout barked toward the ridge, she flinched hard, shrinking into herself. "You know," Elias murmured, "don't you? They're out there." She didn't answer, but the fear in her eyes was answer enough. Later that day, Sheriff Collins rode up the trail with 2 deputies. Dust rose off their horses as they pulled up near the porch. "Elias," the sheriff called, touching his brim. "We need a word." Elias walked out slow, wiping his hands on his trousers. "What about?" Collins leaned forward in his saddle. "Scouts have been spotted. Whole band, maybe more. Folks are spooked. Hank Dobbs swears he saw smoke signals near your side of the ridge." Elias kept his face still. "I've seen nothing." Collins studied him. "If you do, you'd best tell us quick. Army'll be called if it comes to it." The deputies muttered behind him, restless in their saddles. One spat into the dirt. "Savages'll slit a man's throat soon as look at him." Elias's jaw tightened. "Not all of them." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "That a fact?" For a breath, no one moved. Then Collins sighed, adjusting his hat. "Just keep your eyes open, Elias. Times like these, folks start looking for someone to blame. Don't put yourself in that spot." They rode off, leaving dust and unease behind. That evening, as Elias split kindling by the cabin, Taya came to the barn door. She was weak still, leaning on the frame. But she stood. Her eyes tracked the horizon, wary. When Elias looked at her, she lifted her hand and made a small gesture, 2 fingers walking across her palm, then pointing outward. "Scouts," Elias guessed. She nodded once. The weight of it settled in him. They weren't waiting for dawn or justice. They were already here, circling, deciding. At supper, Elias sat with his food untouched, lantern light flickering across the wooden table. Taya sat opposite, silent, her eyes fixed on him. For the first time, she looked less like a child and more like a messenger of something larger than both of them. He cleared his throat. "They'll come. For you." Her gaze didn't waver. And, "If they do, I can't stop them. Not 100, not 50, hell, not 10. He rubbed his face, weary. "But I also can't hand you over to the army. Or to men like Hank Dobbs. You wouldn't survive a day." She lowered her eyes, fingers worrying the fabric of his coat around her shoulders. Elias felt the room closing in. He pushed back from the table and stepped outside into the night air. The prairie was vast and quiet, but he felt eyes on him everywhere. He gripped the porch railing, staring toward the dark ridge. In the stillness, he heard it, the faint beat of a drum. Slow. Far away, Scout whimpered low. Elias swallowed hard. The sound faded, but the dread it left behind clung like smoke. By midnight, he sat in the barn again, rifle across his knees, watching Taya sleep. Each creak of the windmill, each groan of the barnwood made his stomach tighten. He thought of the townsfolk, of Colin's warning, of Hank's suspicion. But most of all, he thought of the choice that sat before him like a coiled snake. He could send her out before the riders came. Let the prairie swallow her back into whatever fate awaited. That would save his skin, his ranch, maybe even the town, or he could keep her, and by keeping her, he would invite the storm right to his doorstep. As if summoned by his thoughts, a new sound drifted through the night. Not hoofbeats this time, not drums. Voices, high, faint, carried by the wind. The chant of riders. Elias gripped the rifle tighter, his throat dry as sand. The storm wasn't coming tomorrow. It was already here. The chanting faded with the night, leaving only silence and the weight of waiting. When dawn broke, pale and cold, Elias stepped outside with his rifle in hand. The prairie stretched out in front of him, endless and deceivingly calm. But he felt it. Eyes, watching, measuring. By mid-morning, smoke rose faint on the horizon. Not ranch smoke. Signal smoke. Elias returned to the barn. Taya was awake, sitting in the hay, her thin hands folded around his old coat. When he entered, she looked at him without fear this time. Only a quiet sadness, like someone who knew what was coming. You understand? He said softly, though he knew she caught only fragments of his meaning. They're out there. She nodded once. That afternoon, the riders came. They appeared on the ridge first, dark silhouettes against the sun, so many Elias stopped counting after 50. By the time they rode closer, the ground shook beneath their horses. They came not in a frenzy but in grim, organized silence, dust rising around them like a shroud. Elias stood in front of the barn, rifle in hand, heart hammering. Scout bristled at his side. The Comanche stopped a stone's throw from the yard, their painted faces unreadable, their horses restless but controlled. From the center, one man dismounted. He was older, broad-shouldered, his braids streaked with gray. His chest was painted with black streaks, his eyes sharp as flint. He stepped forward, calm as a man walking into church. Behind Elias, Taya appeared at the barn door. Her small frame wavered, but her voice rang out clear. Not so, Father. Elias stiffened, glancing between her and the warrior. The man's eyes softened at the sound of her voice, though his expression stayed hard. The warrior spoke, words flowing sharp and fast. Elias couldn't understand, but Taya answered him. Their voices carried across the yard, hers trembling, his deep and steady. Finally, she stepped forward, out from the barn's shadow, still wrapped in Elias's coat. She turned to look at Elias, and in her eyes was something that rooted him to the spot. Gratitude, sorrow, and something deeper he couldn't name. Then she did something he didn't expect. She pointed to him, spoke a word he didn't know. Repeated it firmer. The old warrior turned his gaze on Elias. The silence stretched, heavy as stone. The other riders shifted, restless, hands near their bows. Taya spoke again, softer now, her voice catching. She pressed a hand to her chest, then to Elias's coat around her shoulders. The meaning needed no translation. She was telling them he had saved her. The old warrior's eyes narrowed, studying Elias like a man weighing a horse before trade. Then he spoke a few words, low, deliberate. Taya turned back to Elias, her lips trembling. She stepped closer, reached out and touched the table near the barn wall where Elias had set down his coffee cup earlier. On it sat a small, weathered tintype photograph. His wife, his boy, years gone. She lifted it gently, turned, and held it up for her people to see. The riders murmured, shifting. The old warrior stepped closer, his gaze falling on the image. He said something in a softer tone, as though the photograph had shifted the air itself. Taya turned to Elias again, her eyes shining. He says, you lost. Her words were broken but clear enough. Like us. Elias swallowed hard, throat burning. She placed the tintype back on the table, careful, reverent. Then she looked at him once more. You, kind, not enemy. The weight of it settled over the yard. Even the horses seemed to quiet. Elias felt the eyes of 150 warriors on him, judging, measuring, deciding whether he lived or died based on a girl's trembling words. The old warrior said something sharp, and the riders shifted again. Elias braced, expecting arrows, bullets, something. But then the old man raised his hand and the tension loosened like a rope cut free. Taya stepped closer to Elias, standing beside him now, small and fragile but unafraid. She looked up at him, then at her father. Her voice, though thin, carried. Judge him for his kindness, not for his skin. The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. The old warrior studied Elias one last time. Then, with a slow nod, he turned and mounted his horse. The rest of the riders followed, the sound of hooves rolling like thunder retreating across the plain. When the dust settled, Elias and Taya stood alone again in the yard, the photograph still gleaming faint in the lantern light. The prairie was silent once more, but Elias knew the silence had changed. Something had been given, something returned. Not peace, not yet, but something close. Taya looked up at him, tears brimming, and whispered the only English word she seemed to know without hesitation. Father. The dawn that followed was quiet, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Elias stepped out, onto the porch with his coffee, the steam rising into the cold air. The prairie stretched wide and endless, washed in gold by the rising sun. No riders, no dust, only silence, clean and fragile. Taya sat on the steps, wrapped still in his coat. Her face had color now, the fever gone. Her eyes softer than when he first found her. Scout lay across her feet like a sentry. She turned toward him when he set his cup down, her small hands clutching the fabric tighter around her shoulders. Neither spoke for a long time. The quiet wasn't heavy anymore, it was gentle. By midday, Elias saddled his horse. Taya watched, tense, as though she feared he might send her away. Instead, he nodded toward the horizon. "We'll ride to the ridge. See what's left." They rode slow, the dog trotting alongside. The prairie grass bent in the wind, whispering as they passed. When they reached the ridge, Elias dismounted and scanned the land. The hoofprints were there, hundreds of them pressed deep into the soil leading west. Gone. But near the trail's edge, something remained. A feather lance, planted upright in the earth. It stood tall, wrapped with rawhide, a single crow feather tied to the top. Elias stared at it, understanding its meaning without words. Not a threat, a marker, a sign. Taya slid down from the horse and touched the lance with her fingers, reverent. She murmured a word in her own tongue, something soft, then looked at Elias. Peace. The word fell like water on dry ground. Elias let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. On the ride back, the land seemed changed. The grass looked greener, the sky wider. Even the wind carried something lighter in it. But Elias knew peace was never permanent out here. It was a fragile thing, like a flame in the open. That evening he sat with Taya in the cabin for the first time. She traced her fingers along the edge of the photograph on the table, the faces of his wife and son. Her eyes lifted to his, questioning. "My boy," Elias said softly. His voice caught, but he pushed through. "Taken. Years back." Her gaze held his. For the first time he saw not just a child, not just a survivor, but someone who carried her own share of loss. She reached across the table and touched his hand. No words. None needed. The fire crackled in the hearth. Outside, the coyotes began their night song, but it sounded less like mourning now and more like prayer. Days passed. Taya grew stronger, her steps steadier, her eyes brighter. She began to speak more English, small words, halting but determined. She fed the chickens, gathered wood, even laughed once when Scout chased his tail in circles. One evening, as the sky burned red with sunset, Elias watched her carry water from the windmill. The light caught her face, and for a heartbeat, he saw his boy in her, young, alive, unbroken by the world. And he realized then that saving her had not just changed her life. It had saved his, the townsfolk whispered. Of course. Hank Dobbs rode by once, squinting hard when he saw her near the barn. But Elias stood tall, hand on his rifle, and Hank rode on without a word. Even Sheriff Collins, when he visited weeks later, said nothing. He looked at Taya, then at Elias, and simply nodded before riding away. Winter settled in, sharp and hard. Elias and Taya weathered it together, splitting wood, mending fences, surviving side by side. Each day she spoke more. Each night she sat by the fire with him, her presence filling the hollow spaces he'd thought would never be filled again. Months later, when the first wildflowers returned to the prairie, a small band of Comanche riders appeared on the ridge. Elias felt his chest tighten. But when Taya stepped outside and lifted her hand in greeting, they nodded back. No weapons, no threats, only acknowledgement. They did not stay long. But as they rode away, Elias knew what it meant. She belonged to both worlds now, to hers and to his. Years later, when the world had changed and the frontier was tamed by railroads and fences, folks would speak of Elias McKenna, the lonely rancher who once saved a starving girl. Some would say he did it out of pity, others out of madness. But those who knew better, those who'd seen the way she stood beside him, strong and unafraid, understood the truth. Kindness in a land built on blood is the bravest act a man can choose. And as dawn broke over the prairie each new day, Elias no longer stood alone.